Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Let the weight of the day slip away like autumn leaves on still water. Tonight, we journey back 7 centuries to a time when the world trembled beneath an invisible shadow. A time when death walked the cobblestone streets of medieval Europe, when prayers echoed through empty cathedrals, and when humanity faced its darkest hour with both terror and unexpected grace. This is the story of the Black Death. Not as a tale of mere statistics or medical horror, but as a human symphony of loss, courage, and transformation. It is the story of how darkness can reshape light, how ending can birth beginning, and how even in the deepest winter of the soul, spring somehow finds its way. But before we begin this gentle descent into history's most haunting chapter, if these whispered tales of the past speak to your heart, consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell us what other forgotten stories you'd love to hear, carried on the night wind. Your voice helps keep these ancient echoes alive. Now, dim the lights. Let the world grow quiet around you. Feel yourself sinking into the soft embrace of time itself. We're about to walk through shadows that once fell across an entire continent, but we'll walk slowly, thoughtfully, like pilgrims on a sacred path. Listen, and let history become your lullaby. Imagine, if you will, a morning in October, when the mist still clung to the Black Sea like a grey silk shroud. The year was 1347, and the world was about to change forever, though no one standing on that distant shore could have known it. The salt air carried the usual scents of a medieval port: tar and rope, dried fish, the sweat of merchants haggling over goods from distant lands. But something else rode the wind that morning. Something invisible, patient, and utterly relentless. In the bustling trading post of Kaffa, on the Crimean Peninsula, Genoese merchants went about their daily business with the casual confidence of those who had never known true catastrophe. They had survived storms at sea, bandits on mountain passes, and the occasional siege. Their ships carried silk from China, spices from India, and precious metals from the steppes. They were the arteries of medieval commerce, pumping life and luxury across the known world. The Mongol armies had been besieging Kaffa for months, a familiar dance of medieval warfare. But something was wrong in the Mongol camp. Warriors who had struck fear into the hearts of nations were falling, not to sword or arrow, but to something far more mysterious. They collapsed in their tents, their bodies swelling with dark buboes, their breath growing short and desperate. The Mongol commander, desperate and dying, made a decision that would echo through the centuries. If he could not take Kaffa by force, perhaps he could take it by fear. His soldiers loaded their catapults not with stone, but with the corpses of their fallen comrades. Over the walls of Kaffa, the dead began to rain. The Genoese, horrified but practical, threw the contaminated bodies into the sea. But it was too late. The seeds of catastrophe had already been planted. In the narrow streets of the trading post, among the warehouses stuffed with Eastern treasures, death had found its first European foothold. Within weeks, the survivors fled. 12 galleys slipped away from Kaffa's harbor, their holds filled with more than silk and spices. They carried invisible passengers, tiny, patient demons in the form of fleas, riding on the backs of black rats, harboring bacteria that would reshape the world. The ships moved across the Mediterranean like dark comets, bringing not light but shadow. They docked at Constantinople, where the great Byzantine markets fell silent. They touched the shores of Sicily, where fishing villages became tombs. They sailed into the harbors of Genoa and Venice, those proud maritime republics that had conquered the seas but could not conquer the microscopic. In the ship's belly, among the precious cargo, rats scurried through the darkness. And in their fur, smaller than poppy seeds, fleas waited with the patience of eternity. Each flea carried within its tiny body millions of Yersinia pestis, though no one then knew its name. They knew only that death had learned to sail. The autumn of 1347 was unusually warm in the Mediterranean. Flowers bloomed late, and the harvest was abundant. Children played in the streets of Italian port cities, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had stood for centuries. Merchants counted their coins by candlelight, planning for the profitable winter ahead. None of them knew that winter had already come, dressed not in snow and ice, but in invisible terror that moved from house to house, from breath to breath, from touch to touch. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, carrying with it the power to topple kingdoms, empty cathedrals, and rewrite the very fabric of human civilization. In the quiet of that first night, as the infected ships bobbed gently in harbors from Genoa to Marseille, Europe slept its last peaceful sleep. Tomorrow would bring the first symptoms, the fever, the chills, the terrible swellings. But tonight, in the darkness before the storm, the old world dreamed on, unaware that it was already becoming memory. The Mediterranean lapped gently against the hulls of the plague ships, as if the sea itself were whispering a lullaby for the world that was about to die. The dawn of 1348 broke over Sicily like any other dawn, golden, warm, promising. In the port city of Messina, fishermen mended their nets by the harbor, their weathered hands working with the rhythm of generations. The morning bells of the cathedral called the faithful to prayer, their bronze voices carrying across red-tiled roofs and narrow cobblestone streets. But in the shadows between the ancient stones, something new was stirring, something that would turn prayer into lamentation and mourning into eternal night. Giovanni Boccaccio, the great chronicler, would later write of how death seemed to fall from the very air. But in those first days of 1348, it crept more quietly, a whisper becoming a murmur becoming a scream. The first victims appeared in the neighborhoods closest to the harbor. They were dock workers, merchants, the wives of sailors, people whose lives intersected with the mysterious ships that had arrived from the east. It began with what seemed like a winter fever, chills that made grown men shake like autumn leaves, sweats that soaked through woolen blankets, headaches that felt like hammers against the skull. But then came the swellings, the buboni, dark, painful lumps that appeared in the groin under the arms behind the ears. They grew with terrifying speed, some reaching the size of apples, hard and hot to the touch. The skin around them darkened to deep purple, then black, as if night itself were claiming the body piece by piece. Maria Benedetta, a wine merchant's wife, was among the first to fall. She had been a woman of substance in Messina, known for her sharp wit and her charitable works. The nuns at the convent of Santa Clara had grown accustomed to her weekly visits, her arms full of bread for the poor. But on a Tuesday in January, she collapsed in her own courtyard, her body racked with fever and those terrible swellings. Her husband, Antonio, summoned the city's best physicians. They arrived with their long robes and their grave expressions, carrying pouches of herbs and instruments of silver. They examined her with the confidence of men who had studied the ancient texts, who knew the four humours and could read the signs in a patient's urine. But their knowledge crumbled like parchment in fire. The bloodletting they prescribed only weakened her further. The poultices of crushed garlic and powdered unicorn horn, precious substances that had cost Antonio a fortune, seemed to mock the very concept of healing. The prayers they muttered over her writhing form echoed uselessly in the stone chambers of her house. Maria died on a Thursday as the morning light slanted through the shuttered windows of her bedchamber. But her death was not an ending. It was a beginning. Within days, Antonio himself was burning with fever. Then their son Paolo, barely 16, and dreaming of joining his father's trade. Then the servants, the neighbors, the priest who had come to give last rites. The disease moved through Messina like wildfire through dry grass. It leaped from house to house, from street to street, showing no respect for wealth or poverty, noble birth or common blood. The rich died in their silk sheets, the poor in their straw beds, and death made equals of them all. By February, the city's graveyards were overflowing. The living worked feverishly to dig new burial grounds, but they could not keep pace with the dying. Bodies began to pile up in the streets, covered with rough cloth that fluttered in the Mediterranean breeze like prayer flags in some hellish temple. The Cathedral of Messina, once a place of celebration and community, became a chamber of echoes. The pews that had been filled with families now held only scattered figures, kneeling alone in the vast stone space, their prayers rising like smoke into the soaring arches. The priests, those who had not yet fallen, moved through the city like ghosts, carrying the final sacraments to the dying, with the exhausted dedication of soldiers in a war they knew they could not win. But even in the depths of this horror, there were moments of unexpected grace. Stories spread of wives who nursed their husbands until the end, never leaving their bedside even as the disease claimed them too. Of doctors who continued their rounds long after hope had died, offering comfort where cure was impossible. Of children who cared for their parents with a courage that seemed to come from somewhere beyond their years. The plague was democratic in its cruelty, but humanity proved democratic in its courage. In the face of unimaginable loss, some people discovered reservoirs of compassion they had never known they possessed. They held the hands of the dying, sang lullabies to fevered children, and offered their last pieces of bread to neighbors who had become strangers in their suffering. As winter turned to spring in 1348, the plague began its inexorable march northward. From Sicily it spread to the mainland, to Naples, to Rome, to Florence. Each city it touched became a laboratory of human nature, revealing both the worst and the best of what people could become when stripped of all pretense by the proximity of death. In the evenings, when the day's dead had been counted and the night's vigil begun, the survivors would sometimes gather in the empty squares of their cities. They would light candles and sing, not the complex harmonies of the cathedral, but simple songs their grandmothers had taught them, melodies that seemed to come from the very stones of their ancient streets. And in those moments, with the candlelight flickering against the darkness and their voices rising into the star-filled sky, they created something that even the plague could not destroy, the stubborn, beautiful insistence of human hope in the face of absolute darkness. The Black Death was teaching Europe its first lesson, that even in the valley of the shadow of death, there were still songs to be sung. Spring arrived in Avignon with a cruel beauty that year. The palace of the popes, that massive fortress of faith rising from the banks of the Rhône, gleamed white against the Provençal sky. Cherry blossoms drifted through the papal gardens like snow, and the vineyards on the surrounding hills burst with new green life. It was as if nature herself were mocking the darkness that approached on every road leading to the city. Pope Clement VI stood at the window of his private chamber, watching the river flow past with its eternal patience. He was a man of learning and luxury, more comfortable with the politics of earthly power than the mysteries of divine will. His court was the most magnificent in Europe, filled with scholars, artists, and diplomats who had made Avignon a rival to Rome itself. But reports were arriving daily that chilled his blood more than any winter wind. From the south came tales that seemed torn from the pages of Revelation, entire cities falling silent, cathedrals filled with corpses, priests dying faster than they could be ordained. The merchants who still dared to travel spoke in whispers of streets where grass grew between the cobblestones, of houses where doors stood open to rooms where no one would ever return. The plague had crossed the Alps like an invisible army, moving through the mountain passes with the patience of winter itself. It flowed down into the valleys of France, following the trade routes that had once brought prosperity, now bringing only death. Each town it touched became a mirror of those Italian cities. First the fever, then the swellings, then the terrible democracy of the grave. In Paris, the greatest city north of the Alps, the university fell silent for the first time in centuries. Students who had come from across Europe to study theology and philosophy found themselves learning harder lessons in the narrow streets around the cathedral. The masters of the schools, those proud inheritors of Aristotle and Aquinas, discovered that all their knowledge was useless against an enemy that could not be reasoned with, debated, or prayed away. But it was in the smaller towns and villages that the plague's true character revealed itself. In places like Carcassonne, where the ancient walls had protected generations from earthly enemies, the pestilence simply drifted through the gates like morning mist. It settled into the medieval rhythms of daily life, the morning markets, the evening vespers, the seasonal festivals that had marked time for centuries. Pierre Dubois, a wool merchant in the town of Rennes, kept a diary during those months that would later be found in the ruins of his house. His entries, written in a careful hand that grew shakier with each passing day, told the story of a world coming apart. The feast of St. Martin passed in silence this year. The square where we used to dance stood empty, save for the cats that now roam freely through the abandoned houses. They seem to know something we do not, that the world belongs to the scavengers now. My neighbor Jacques died yesterday. He was a good man, a maker of barrels, and his hands could shape wood like a poet shapes words. I helped carry him to the churchyard, though Father Bernard says we may soon run out of consecrated ground. Where do the dead go when the earth itself is full? The children are the hardest to watch. They do not understand why their games have ended, why their parents whisper instead of sing. Little Marie asked me today why God is angry with us. I had no answer. Perhaps there is no answer to give. The plague did not simply kill, it transformed. Villages that had known the same families for generations suddenly found themselves populated by strangers, survivors who had fled from other devastated places. Ancient traditions died with their keepers. The oral histories that had been passed down through centuries vanished when the last storyteller fell silent. In the monasteries, those islands of learning and prayer, the disease found easy prey. The monks, living in close community, sharing meals and prayers, could not escape the intimacy of contagion. The great Abbey of Cluny, which had been a beacon of Christian civilization for centuries, lost 3/4 of its brothers in a single month. The illuminated manuscripts they had been copying lay unfinished on their desks, their bright colors fading in the empty scriptoriums. Yet even in these darkest moments, there were points of light. Some communities, led by wise physicians or blessed with natural isolation, managed to limit the plague's spread. They closed their gates to outsiders, imposed strict quarantines, and prayed with a discipline that bordered on desperation. These survivors became the custodians of memory, keeping alive the stories of those who had fallen. In Avignon, Pope Clement XVI made a decision that would echo through history. Unable to physically comfort his suffering flock, he issued a papal bull granting remission of sins to all who died of the plague. It was a theological revolution born of practical necessity. If the Church could not save bodies, it could at least promise to save souls. The papal court became a strange mixture of terror and defiance. Cardinals who had spent their lives in political maneuvering now found themselves confronting questions that had no earthly answers. They continued their ceremonies, their elaborate rituals, their careful protocols, as if the maintenance of form could somehow hold back the chaos that pressed against their palace walls. But late at night, when the official prayers had ended and the courtiers had retreated to their chambers, a different kind of devotion emerged. Small groups gathered in the chapel, not for formal liturgy, but for something more primitive and honest. They sang the simple songs their mothers had taught them, held each other's hands, and wept for a world that was disappearing even as they watched. The plague was teaching its second lesson, that in the face of ultimate mystery, all the complexity of civilization might collapse into something far simpler and more essential. Not the elaborate theology of the schools, but the basic human need to comfort and be comforted. Not the intricate politics of courts, but the fundamental recognition that all people, regardless of rank or learning, were equally fragile in the face of death. As summer approached, the pestilence continued its northward march. It would soon reach England, that island kingdom that had always prided itself on its separation from continental troubles. But the sea that had protected England from armies would prove no barrier to a disease that traveled in the holds of ships, patient and invisible as the tide itself. In the evening light that slanted through the windows of the palace of the popes, Clement Thixigx continued his lonely vigil. He had become the shepherd of a flock that was disappearing, the keeper of a faith that was being tested as never before. But he did not yet know that the plague would spare him, that he would live to see the world that emerged from this darkness, a world that would never again take for granted the simple miracle of breathing through another day. The bells of Avignon still rang the hours, their bronze voices carrying across the river and into the countryside beyond. But fewer and fewer people rose to answer their call, and the echo that came back from the surrounding hills grew fainter with each passing day. The white cliffs of Dover had stood like sentinels against the continent for countless centuries, their chalk faces weathered by salt spray and time. English kings had looked across the narrow channel and seen opportunity or threat, but always something foreign, something other. The sea had been their moat, their protection, their blessing. But in the summer of 1348, the sea became a bridge. On a warm August morning, when the mist still clung to the harbour like a lover's whisper, a ship from Calais docked at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. It was an ordinary vessel, carrying the usual cargo of wool and wine, manned by sailors who seemed no different from any others. They spoke of good weather on the crossing, of profitable trading, of the small concerns that filled the lives of working men. They did not speak of the rats in the ship's hold, or the fleas in the rat's fur, or the invisible death that rode in the fleas' bellies. They did not know that they were the harbingers of England's darkest hour. The plague announced itself in England, not with fanfare but with a whisper. A dock worker in Melcombe Regis complained of feeling unwell after unloading the ship. By evening, he was burning with fever. By the next morning, the terrible swellings had appeared. By week's end, he was dead, and the disease had begun its patient work of transformation. From Dorset, the pestilence spread like ripples on still water. It moved along the ancient Roman roads, through the market towns where wool merchants gathered, into the cathedral cities where bishops prayed for deliverance that would not come. It flowed like a dark river through the English countryside, touching manor houses and peasant cottages with the same inexorable certainty. In Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, the cathedral bells that had rung for centuries began to toll more frequently. The bishop, William Eddington, watched from his palace windows as funeral processions became a daily sight in the streets below. The cathedral cemetery, which had seemed vast enough for eternity, began to fill with an alarming speed. The plague reached London in the autumn of 1348, just as the leaves were turning gold and crimson in the royal parks. The great city, with its narrow streets and teeming population, proved as vulnerable as any Italian port. The disease moved through the crowded neighborhoods like fire through dry timber, leaping from house to house, from parish to parish, from the docks of the Thames to the halls of Westminster. King Edward III, that warrior king who had humbled the French at Crécy, found himself facing an enemy that could not be conquered by English longbows or knightly courage. He retreated to Windsor Castle with his court, hoping that stone walls and royal privilege might provide protection. But the plague was a democratic force, and it had its own ideas about the divine right of kings. In the villages of England, where life had followed the same patterns for generations, the pestilence brought changes that would have been unimaginable just months before. The manor of Halesowen in the West Midlands lost more than half its population in 6 months. Fields that had been carefully tended by the same families for centuries stood empty, their crops rotting in the autumn rains. The parish church of St. Kenelm, which had anchored the community's spiritual life for generations, became a scene of desperate improvisation. The priest, Father Thomas, continued his duties even as his parishioners died around him. He performed funeral rites until his voice was hoarse, blessed the dying until his hands shook with exhaustion, and tried to maintain some semblance of divine order in a world that seemed to have lost its way. But it was in the details of daily life that the plague's true impact became clear. The blacksmith's forge grew cold because there was no one left to work the bellows. The mill wheel stopped turning because the miller had died, and no one remained who knew the ancient secrets of its operation. The children's voices that had filled the village square fell silent, not because they had been forbidden to play, but because so many of them lay buried in the churchyard's expanding borders. Margaret of Ashby, the wife of a prosperous wool merchant, kept a household account book that recorded the plague's progress in the language of domestic economy. Her entries, written in the careful script of a woman trained in the management of a great house, told a story of gradual collapse. Paid to John the cook for his services until the feast of St. Michael, 3 shillings. Note: John died of the sickness before he could collect his wages. Purchased candles for the chapel, as we must pray constantly now. The servants are too frightened to sleep in their usual quarters, and we all gather in the hall at night. No entry for this week. My husband has taken ill, and I fear what the morning will bring. If anyone finds this book, please remember that we were once happy here. The plague transformed not just individuals, but entire social structures. The feudal system that had governed England for centuries began to crack under the pressure of massive population loss. Lords who had once commanded hundreds of peasants found themselves with empty manors and rotting crops. The ancient bonds of obligation that had held society together started to dissolve when there were too few people left to maintain them. But in the midst of this dissolution, new forms of human connection emerged. Survivors who had lost their birth families formed new bonds with other survivors. Villages that had been depleted were repopulated by refugees from other devastated areas. The plague was breaking down the old world, but it was also creating spaces for new forms of community to emerge. In the great Cathedral of Canterbury, Archbishop Thomas Bradwardine struggled to make sense of the catastrophe in theological terms. He had been a renowned scholar at Oxford, a man who believed that divine will could be understood through careful reasoning and scriptural study. But the plague challenged all his assumptions about God's relationship to the world. His sermons during this period, preserved in the cathedral archives, show a man wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. How could a just God allow such suffering? What meaning could be found in the death of innocents? Was the plague a punishment for sin, or simply a mystery too deep for human understanding? We are like children lost in a dark wood, he wrote in one sermon, calling out for our Father and hearing only the echo of our own voices. But even in this darkness we are not alone. The God who made us is with us in our suffering, weeping with us for the world that is passing away. The plague was teaching England its third lesson, that even the strongest walls could not keep out the forces that truly mattered. Not the stone walls of castles, nor the social walls of hierarchy, nor the mental walls of human understanding. In the face of ultimate mystery, all barriers became permeable, all certainties became questions, all assumptions became prayers. As winter approached, the plague began to slow its advance, not from any human intervention, but from the natural rhythms of disease and season. But the England that emerged from this first wave of pestilence was not the England that had greeted the ship from Calais. It was a country that had learned to live with empty spaces, to find meaning in loss, to discover that even in the depths of devastation, life somehow found a way to continue. In the quiet of the winter nights, when the wind howled across the empty fields, and the few remaining candles flickered in cottage windows, England settled into its new reality. The plague had passed through like a terrible storm, leaving behind a landscape that was both familiar and utterly changed. And in that changed landscape, the survivors began the long work of rebuilding not just their communities, but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where death was always just a breath away. The Rhine flowed through the heart of Europe like a silver thread, connecting the mountain passes of the Alps to the North Sea's grey waters. For centuries, it had carried more than water. It bore the commerce, the culture, the very lifeblood of the Holy Roman Empire. From Basel to Cologne, from Strasbourg to Mainz, the river cities had grown rich on trade and proud of their ancient privileges. But in the autumn of 1348, the Rhine carried something else, whispers of a darkness that had already consumed the south. The plague moved up the river valleys like a tide, following the same routes that had brought prosperity, now bringing only sorrow. In Strasbourg, that jewel of the Alsace where German and French cultures had mingled for generations, the first cases appeared among the river workers and wine merchants. The city had always prided itself on its cosmopolitan character, its tolerance for different peoples and different ways of life, but the plague would test that tolerance in ways no one could have imagined. The disease arrived in the city just as the leaves were turning gold on the cathedral's surrounding trees. The great spire, still under construction, rose like a prayer into the autumn sky, its stones carved by craftsmen who believed they were building for eternity. But eternity seemed suddenly fragile when faced with the reality of bodies piling up in the streets below. Dr. Heinrich Münzer, the city's most learned physician, had studied at the University of Paris and possessed one of the finest medical libraries in the Germanic lands. His house on the Rue des Orfèvres was filled with the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the works of Galen and Hippocrates, the commentaries of Avicenna, the newest translations from Arabic masters. But all this knowledge crumbled like autumn leaves when faced with the plague's inexorable advance. He tried everything his learning suggested: bloodletting and purging, aromatic herbs and precious stones, prayers and incantations. He mixed potions of ground pearls and powdered gold, believing that the disease might be driven out by substances of corresponding value. But the plague mocked his efforts, taking his patients with the same cruel efficiency, whether they were treated with the most expensive remedies or left to suffer in simple poverty. The social fabric of Strasbourg began to unravel as the death toll mounted. The guild system that had governed the city for generations started to collapse as entire workshops fell silent. The goldsmiths who had created treasures for princes found their forges cold. The stone masons working on the cathedral abandoned their scaffolds, leaving the great building to stand half-finished against the sky, like a prayer interrupted. But it was in the treatment of the Jewish community that the plague revealed humanity's capacity for both cruelty and courage. As the death toll mounted and fear turned to desperation, some began to seek scapegoats for the inexplicable catastrophe. Ancient prejudices, normally kept in check by law and custom, erupted with volcanic force. Rumors spread through the Christian quarters that the Jews had poisoned the wells, that they had made a pact with the devil to destroy Christendom. The accusations were absurd. Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as everyone else. But fear is not always rational, and desperate people will sometimes grasp at any explanation that promises to make sense of chaos. On February 14, 1349, the day that should have been dedicated to love, Strasbourg witnessed one of the darkest episodes in its history. A mob gathered in the Jewish quarter, driven by grief and terror into acts of unspeakable violence. The synagogue, that center of learning and prayer, was set ablaze. Families who had lived in the city for generations were driven from their homes or worse. But even in this darkness, there were points of light. Some Christian citizens risked their own lives to protect their Jewish neighbors. The bishop spoke out against the violence, though his words were drowned out by the mob's roar. A few brave souls hid Jewish families in their cellars, sharing their meager food and offering comfort in the midst of terror. The plague was teaching its fourth lesson, that in times of crisis, human nature could reveal itself in all its complexity. The same species capable of creating soaring cathedrals and subtle philosophies could also turn to savage cruelty when faced with the inexplicable. Yet, even in the darkest moments, there were always those who chose compassion over fear, understanding over hatred. As winter deepened, the plague spread through the Germanic lands like a slow fire. In Cologne, the great cathedral city on the Rhine, the archbishop led continuous prayers for deliverance. The cathedral's bells tolled almost constantly, their bronze voices carrying across the city like a heartbeat that refused to stop. But the prayers seemed to rise into empty air, and the bells tolled for too many dead to count. In the smaller towns and villages scattered through the German forests, the plague took on a different character. These communities, more isolated and self-sufficient than the river cities, sometimes managed to close themselves off from the outside world. They posted guards on the roads, turned away all strangers, and tried to wait out the storm in isolation. Some of these communities succeeded in avoiding the worst of the pestilence. They became islands of survival in a sea of death, preserving not just their people, but their customs, their stories, their memories of the world before the plague. But isolation came at a price. They lived in constant fear, never knowing when the disease might find them despite their precautions. The monastery of Reichenau, on its island in Lake Constance, became a refuge for scholars and scribes fleeing the chaos on the mainland. The monks continued their ancient work of copying manuscripts, preserving the learning of the past for whatever future might emerge from the present darkness. Their scriptorium became a kind of ark, carrying the treasures of human knowledge across the flood of death. Brother Matthias, the monastery's finest illuminator, worked by candlelight to complete a book of hours that had been commissioned by a noble family who had since perished. His delicate paintings of saints and angels seemed to glow with an inner light in the winter darkness. He painted not for earthly patrons now, but for the simple need to create beauty in a world that had grown ugly with suffering. The plague was changing more than just the population of the Germanic lands. It was transforming the very nature of faith and philosophy. The scholastic certainties that had dominated medieval thought began to crack under the pressure of inexplicable suffering. How could the ordered universe of Thomas Aquinas accommodate such random destruction? How could the just God of Christian theology allow the innocent to suffer alongside the guilty? New forms of religious expression emerged from this crisis. The flagellants, those penitents who whipped themselves in public processions, sought to appease divine wrath through self-inflicted suffering. They moved through the countryside like living embodiments of the age's pain, their bloody backs and anguished prayers a physical manifestation of humanity's desperate desire for redemption. But there were also quieter forms of spiritual response. In hidden chapels and private chambers, people began to develop more personal, more intimate relationships with the divine. They spoke to God not as distant subjects to an absolute monarch, but as children to a parent, as friends to a friend. The plague was stripping away the elaborate hierarchies of medieval religion, leaving behind something more immediate and more human. As spring approached in 1349, the plague began to show signs of exhaustion. The death toll in many cities started to decline, not because of any human intervention, but because the disease had simply run out of victims. The survivors emerged from their houses like people waking from a nightmare, blinking in the sunlight, and wondering if the world they remembered had been real or just a dream. The Holy Roman Empire that began to reconstitute itself in the plague's wake was different from the one that had existed before. It was smaller, more fragile, more aware of its own mortality, but it was also, in some ways, more human. The shared experience of loss had created new bonds between survivors, new forms of solidarity that transcended the old divisions of class and region. In the Cathedral of Strasbourg, work resumed on the great spire. The masons who returned to their scaffolds were not the same men who had left, but they carried within them the same ancient drive to create something lasting, something beautiful, something that might outlast the darkness they had witnessed. Stone by stone they continued building toward the sky, their labor a prayer made manifest in granite and faith. The plague had taught the Germanic lands that even the most solid-seeming structures could crumble, that even the most carefully constructed philosophies could collapse. But it had also taught them that from the ruins of the old world, new forms of beauty and meaning could emerge. The human spirit, wounded but not broken, would find ways to rebuild not just cities and churches, but hope itself. The northern lands had always seemed like the edge of the world, places where the aurora borealis painted the winter sky and the summer sun barely set. In the fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden and the emerging towns of Denmark, life followed rhythms older than Christianity itself. The plague had consumed the south, but surely it could not reach these distant shores, these hardy peoples who had survived Viking raids and endless winters. But the plague was patient, and it traveled with the merchants and the pilgrims, the fishermen and the traders, who connected even the most remote communities to the wider world. In the spring of 1349, it arrived in Bergen, Norway's greatest port, carried in the holds of Hanseatic ships that had sailed from plague-ravaged London. Bergen had always been a city of the sea, its wooden houses climbing the hillsides like colorful flowers growing from the rocky soil. The harbor was filled with ships from across northern Europe, English wool traders, German merchants, Danish fishing vessels. The city's prosperity came from this maritime connection, but connection was a double-edged sword when the plague rode the waves. The disease struck Bergen with particular cruelty. The city's population, crowded into wooden buildings that shared walls and courtyards, had little defense against contagion. The narrow streets that had once echoed with the voices of merchants haggling in a dozen languages fell silent as the plague moved through the community like a silent harvester. King Magnus VII of Norway, who ruled from his court in Oslo, received reports of the devastation with growing alarm. He was a young king, barely 25, who had inherited a realm that seemed secure in its northern fastness. But the plague was teaching him that no kingdom was truly safe, that the forces that shaped history recognized no boundaries drawn by human hands. The king issued proclamations calling for prayer and penance for the closing of taverns and the cessation of frivolous entertainments. He commanded that all citizens should fast and attend church services, hoping that divine intervention might spare his realm from the fate that had befallen the south. But his commands echoed uselessly in streets that were already emptying, in churches where the priests themselves were falling silent. In the smaller fishing villages along the Norwegian coast, the plague took on an almost mythic quality. These communities, isolated by geography and weather, had always lived close to the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. The aurora borealis, the midnight sun, the deep fjords that seemed to stretch into other realms, all these had prepared them for mysteries that defied ordinary understanding. The plague was just another such mystery, but one that touched their lives with devastating immediacy. In the village of Loen, nestled deep in a fjord surrounded by towering mountains, the population dropped from 300 to fewer than 50 in the space of 2 months. The survivors, mostly the very young and the very old, found themselves guardians of a ghost town, where the wind whistled through empty houses and the fishing nets rotted on abandoned boats. Old Helga Eriksdottir, who had lived through 80 winters and remembered the old stories from before the priests came, interpreted the plague through the lens of ancient wisdom. She spoke of Ragnarok, the end of the world prophesied in the elder tales, when the gods themselves would die and the earth would be consumed by fire and flood. But she also spoke of the new world that would emerge from the ashes, where the surviving gods would rebuild and life would begin again. Her words brought comfort to the few who remained, not because they believed literally in the old myths, but because they offered a framework for understanding suffering that seemed to transcend human comprehension. The plague was not just a disease, it was a cosmic event, a reshaping of reality itself. In Sweden, the plague followed the trade routes that connected the Baltic ports to the interior forests. Stockholm, that young city built on islands in the archipelago, tried to protect itself by restricting travel and trade. But the plague had already taken root in the trading communities that formed the city's lifeblood. The Swedish countryside, with its vast forests and scattered farmsteads, might have seemed naturally protected from contagion. But the plague proved that isolation was an illusion. It moved along the rivers and forest paths with the same inexorable patience it had shown in the crowded cities of the south. Remote farm families who had not seen strangers for months suddenly found themselves facing the same symptoms, the same terrible certainty that had claimed millions of their southern neighbors. In the great monastery of Vadstena, founded by the mystic Birgitta, the nuns and monks continued their prayers even as the plague moved through their community. They had dedicated their lives to contemplating the suffering of Christ, but now they found themselves participating in suffering that seemed to echo the very passion they had spent their lives meditating upon. Sister Margareta, who had taken her vows just 3 years earlier, wrote in her diary during the plague's worst months, "We are like the disciples in the garden, watching with our Lord through the dark hours. But this darkness seems to have no dawn, and we begin to understand that perhaps the watching itself is the prayer, the staying awake itself is the offering we can make." The plague reached Denmark in the autumn of 1349, carried by ships that docked in Copenhagen and Aarhus. The Danish kingdom, with its rich agricultural lands and growing towns, had been experiencing a golden age of prosperity and cultural development, but the plague stripped away these achievements with ruthless efficiency, reducing great plans to empty dreams and proud cities to collections of vacant houses. King Valdemar IV, known as Valdemar the Victorious, had spent his reign expanding Danish power in the Baltic. He was a man accustomed to conquest, to the projection of royal will across land and sea. But the plague was an enemy that could not be defeated by military might or political cunning. It respected no royal commands, recognized no treaties, and conquered without offering terms for surrender. The Danish chronicles of this period, written by monks who somehow survived the devastation, record not just the facts of death and destruction, but the slow process of psychological adjustment to a new reality. The chroniclers write of dreams that haunted the survivors, of visions that seemed to come from the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. In the Cathedral of Roskilde, where Danish kings had been crowned for generations, the great spaces designed for ceremony and celebration became chambers of lamentation. The royal tombs, those monuments to earthly power and glory, seemed to mock the living with their reminders of mortality. But the cathedral also became a place of unexpected comfort, where survivors gathered not for formal services, but for the simple human need to be together in the face of overwhelming loss. The plague was teaching the northern lands its fifth lesson, that even the most remote communities were part of a larger human story, that isolation was ultimately impossible in a world connected by trade, travel, and the simple fact of shared humanity. The aurora borealis still painted the winter sky, the midnight sun still marked the summer solstice, but the people who witnessed these natural wonders had been changed by their encounter with forces that transcended the natural world. As the plague began to exhaust itself in the northern reaches, as the worst of the dying ended and the slow work of survival began, the survivors found themselves inheritors of a transformed world. They were fewer in number, but perhaps richer in understanding. They had looked into the abyss and discovered that even in the depths of darkness, the human capacity for endurance, for compassion, for hope, could not be entirely extinguished. The northern lights continued to dance across the polar sky, and the survivors who watched them from the windows of half-empty towns began to see in their shimmering patterns not just a natural phenomenon, but a reminder that beauty and mystery would outlast even the greatest catastrophes. The plague had passed through like a terrible storm, but the stars remained, and in their light, the slow work of rebuilding could begin. In the silence that followed the plague's passing, the northern lands began to dream new dreams, to imagine new possibilities for the communities that would emerge from the ashes of the old world. The long winter was ending, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the first whispers of a spring that would be unlike any spring that had come before. The great dying had passed like a storm across the medieval world, leaving behind a landscape that was both familiar and utterly transformed. In the quiet that followed the plague's retreat, Europe began to count its losses and wonder what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of the old. The numbers, when chroniclers finally attempted to calculate them, were staggering. Perhaps a third of Europe's population had perished, maybe more. Entire bloodlines had been extinguished, ancient skills had died with their last practitioners, and communities that had existed for centuries had simply ceased to be. The demographic catastrophe was so complete that it would take generations for the population to recover, and in some places it never would. But numbers could not capture the full extent of the transformation. The plague had not just killed people, it had killed certainties, assumptions, entire ways of understanding the world. The medieval synthesis that had held European civilization together for centuries had cracked under the pressure of inexplicable suffering, and through those cracks, new possibilities were beginning to emerge. In the monastery of Saint-Denis, outside Paris, Brother Guillaume continued his work as a chronicler, but his entries for the years following the plague's passage revealed a world struggling to make sense of its own survival. The monastery had lost half its brothers, and the survivors moved through the vast stone corridors like ghosts haunting their own past. "We who remain," he wrote, "are like people who have witnessed the end of the world and found ourselves still alive on the other side. We know things now that we never wanted to know, how quickly the familiar can become strange, how thin the line between civilization and chaos, how precious is each breath we take without thinking." The economic consequences of the plague were as dramatic as the human losses. Entire industries had collapsed when their workers died. The great wool trade that had connected England to Flanders ground to a halt. The vineyards of Burgundy stood untended, their grapes rotting on the vine. The silver mines of Bohemia fell silent when there were no longer enough miners to work the shafts. But this economic collapse also created opportunities. The survivors found themselves in a world where labor was suddenly scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants who had been bound to the land for generations discovered that they could demand wages, choose their masters, even move to new communities where their skills were desperately needed. In England, the old feudal system began to crumble as lords found themselves unable to maintain their ancient privileges over populations that had been decimated. The Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. The economic realities created by the plague were stronger than any law, and slowly, gradually, the rigid hierarchies of medieval society began to give way to more fluid arrangements. The plague had also created a crisis of faith that would reshape European Christianity for centuries to come. The elaborate theological systems that had explained God's relationship to the world seemed inadequate when faced with the reality of innocent suffering on such a massive scale. How could the God of love and justice allow such devastation? What meaning could be found in the deaths of children, of holy men, of entire communities that had lived piously and faithfully? Some responded to this crisis by turning away from institutional religion entirely. They became skeptics, questioning not just the authority of the Church, but the very existence of a divine plan. Others turned inward, developing more personal, more mystical forms of faith that emphasized direct experience over theological doctrine. The mystic Meister Eckhart, who had died just before the plague's arrival, had already begun to articulate a theology that would prove prophetic for the post-plague world. His emphasis on the individual soul's direct relationship with God, his insistence that the divine could be found in the depths of human experience, offered a framework for faith that did not depend on the mediation of institutions or the comfort of easy answers. In the cathedral schools and universities that had survived the plague, scholars began to develop new approaches to learning that reflected the changed world around them. The confident rationalism of the scholastic period gave way to a more humble, more experimental approach to knowledge. The plague had taught them that human reason had limits, that there were mysteries that could not be solved by logical analysis alone. The University of Paris, which had been the intellectual center of medieval Europe, slowly began to reconstitute itself in the plague's aftermath. But the scholars who returned to their studies were different from those chapter 7. The reckoning continued, who had fled when the pestilence first arrived. They had seen the collapse of certainty, the fragility of all human endeavors, and this knowledge colored everything they wrote and taught. William of Ockham's principle, that the simplest explanation was usually the correct one, gained new relevance in a world where elaborate theories had proven useless against the plague's advance. Scholars began to value observation over authority, experience over tradition. The seeds of what would later become the scientific revolution were planted in the soil of post-plague doubt and questioning. The visual arts, too, began to reflect the transformed consciousness of the survivors. The serene, otherworldly beauty of earlier medieval art gave way to something more human, more immediate, more aware of mortality. Artists who had lived through the plague could not paint as if death were a distant abstraction. It had to be acknowledged, incorporated, made part of the artistic vision. In the workshops of Florence, painters like Andrea Occagna created altarpieces that showed paradise and hell with equal vividness. But it was the hell that seemed most real to viewers who had witnessed something very like it in the streets of their own cities. The Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, became a popular artistic theme, showing kings and peasants, bishops and beggars, all equal in the face of the grim reaper's call. But perhaps the most profound change brought by the plague was in humanity's relationship with time itself. Before the pestilence, time had seemed infinite, progress inevitable, the future a vast expanse of possibility. The plague compressed time, made every moment precious, every relationship fragile, every achievement temporary. This new consciousness of mortality paradoxically led to a greater appreciation of life's beauty and meaning. If existence was brief and uncertain, then it became more important to live fully, to love deeply, to create something of lasting value. The Renaissance that would emerge from the plague's ashes would be marked by an intensity, a passion for life and learning that might never have developed without the dark tutorial of the Black Death. The survivors also found themselves custodians of memory. With so many dead, the responsibility for preserving the past fell on fewer shoulders. They became living libraries, carrying within themselves the stories, songs, and skills that might otherwise have been lost forever. This burden of memory was both precious and painful. They were the bridges between the world that had been and the world that was becoming. In the village of Ayam, high in the English Peak District, the survivors erected a simple stone memorial to those who had died. The inscription was brief: "Remember us as we were and live as we could not." It captured something essential about the post-plague consciousness, the duty to honor the dead by embracing life, to make meaning from loss, to find hope in the midst of devastation. The plague had taught its sixth lesson, that transformation and destruction were often the same process viewed from different angles. What seemed like ending was also beginning. What appeared to be chaos was also creation. The medieval world had died, but from its death something new was being born, something more human, more humble, more aware of both its own fragility and its own potential for renewal. As the survivors settled into their transformed world, they began to develop new rituals, new traditions, new ways of marking the passage of time that acknowledged both loss and hope. They planted gardens where houses had stood empty. They sang new songs that incorporated old melodies. They told stories that wove together memory and possibility. The plague was becoming history, but history with a special character, not just a chronicle of events, but a testament to human endurance, a reminder that even the darkest chapters could give way to new beginnings. The survivors were writing that history not just in books and chronicles, but in the ways they chose to live, the communities they built, the love they showed to one another in a world that had learned how quickly love could be lost. In the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, which had stood witness to the plague's passage through the greatest city of medieval Europe, a new window was installed in the years following the pestilence. It showed not the traditional scenes of biblical history, but the story of the plague itself, the suffering, the loss, the courage of those who had cared for the dying, and finally, the slow return of hope. The light that streamed through that window would illuminate the prayers of generations to come, carrying within its colored rays the memory of humanity's darkest hour and its stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. The plague was ending, but its lessons would endure, woven into the fabric of European consciousness like threads of shadow and gold in an intricate tapestry. The great dying was over, but the great learning had just begun. In the decade following the plague's retreat, a new generation began to emerge, children born into a world fundamentally different from the one their parents had known. These were the children of the plague, shaped not by the disease itself but by its aftermath, by the stories they heard and the silences they inherited. Marie de Clermont was born in the spring of 1351, in a manor house outside Reims that had once housed a family of 12, but now sheltered only her parents and an elderly servant who had somehow survived when all the others perished. Her childhood was marked by the strange abundance that followed scarcity, vast rooms to play in alone, gardens grown wild and wonderful, libraries filled with books whose authors lay buried in the cathedral yard. But it was also marked by a particular kind of silence. The songs her mother hummed were melancholy ones, melodies that seemed to carry the weight of absent voices. The stories she heard were often interrupted by long pauses, as if the tellers were listening for voices that would never answer. She grew up in a house full of ghosts, though she would not understand this until much later. Marie's education was unlike that of any generation before her. With so many traditional teachers dead, her parents hired scholars who had survived by questioning everything, who had learned to value observation over authority, experience over tradition. They taught her to read not just Latin and French, but the new vernacular texts that were emerging across Europe. Stories written for people who wanted to understand their own experience rather than simply accept the wisdom of the past. Her tutor, Master Jean, had been a student at the University of Paris during the plague years. He had watched his professors die one by one, had seen the great libraries stand empty, had witnessed the collapse of intellectual certainties that had seemed as solid as the cathedral stones. He taught Marie not with the confidence of absolute knowledge, but with the humility of someone who had learned that all human understanding was provisional, temporary, subject to revision by forces beyond human control. "The world is not a book to be read," he told her one autumn afternoon as they walked through the overgrown gardens, "but a mystery to be lived. The plague taught us that we know less than we thought, but also that we are capable of more than we imagined." In England, young Thomas Langland grew up in a village where half the houses stood empty, their thatched roofs slowly collapsing under the weight of neglect. But this physical decay was accompanied by a strange social vitality. With traditional hierarchies weakened, with labor scarce and therefore valuable, with ancient customs disrupted, new forms of community were emerging. Thomas watched his father, once a bound serf, negotiate wages with lords who had previously commanded his labor without payment. He saw peasant families move freely from village to village, seeking better opportunities, better treatment, better lives. The rigid social structure that had defined English life for centuries was becoming fluid, and Thomas grew up assuming that change was normal, that improvement was possible, that the future need not replicate the past. This assumption would shape his entire generation. They were the first Europeans in centuries to grow up believing that their lives might be fundamentally different from their parents' lives, not because of catastrophe, but because of choice. The plague had inadvertently created space for social mobility, for innovation, for the kind of questioning that would eventually reshape European civilization. In the German lands, young Anna von Brandenburg learned to read from illuminated manuscripts that had been rescued from abandoned monasteries. The books themselves were works of art, their margins filled with intricate drawings of plants and animals, their initial letters glowing with gold and lapis lazuli. But the stories they contained were often incomplete. The plague had killed the scribes before they could finish their work. Anna developed the habit of completing these unfinished stories in her imagination. She would stare at a half-painted angel and envision the wings that had never been drawn. She would read a tale that broke off mid-sentence and invent her own ending. This creative completion became a metaphor for her generation's relationship with the inherited culture. They were not just receivers of tradition, but active participants in its recreation. The children of the plague were also the first generation to grow up with a visceral understanding of mortality, not as an abstract theological concept, but as a lived reality. They had been born into houses marked by absence, had learned to speak from adults who flinched at unexpected sounds, had played in churchyards where the recently dug graves outnumbered the weathered monuments of centuries past. This awareness of death's proximity might have made them morbid, but instead it seemed to intensify their appreciation of life. They played with a particular kind of intensity, loved with a particular kind of passion, learned with a particular kind of urgency. They understood in ways their ancestors had not, that time was precious because it was limited. In Florence, young Giovanni Di Marco grew up listening to his grandfather's stories of the plague years. The old man had been one of the few physicians to survive, had watched his colleagues die one by one, while he continued his rounds through the empty streets. But his stories were not just about death and suffering. They were about the moments of grace that had appeared even in the darkest hours. He told Giovanni about the nun who had continued to sing to dying children, even after her own voice had grown hoarse with exhaustion. About the merchant who had given away his fortune to feed the hungry, saying that gold was useless when there was no one left to spend it on. About the ordinary people who had discovered extraordinary reserves of courage, compassion, and hope. These stories shaped Giovanni's understanding of what it meant to be human. He learned that people were capable of both great cruelty and great kindness, that catastrophe could bring out the worst and the best in human nature. That meaning could be found even in the midst of meaninglessness. This complex understanding would mark his generation's approach to philosophy, to art, to the very business of living. The children of the plague were also the first generation to benefit from the economic opportunities created by population loss. With fewer people competing for resources, with traditional restrictions weakened, with new needs creating new possibilities, they found themselves with choices that would have been unimaginable to their parents. Young merchants could establish trade routes to replace the ones that had been broken by the plague. Artisans could experiment with new techniques without worrying about guild restrictions that had been weakened by the loss of senior members. Scholars could pursue new lines of inquiry without facing the resistance of established authorities who had not survived to object. But perhaps most importantly, the children of the plague inherited a transformed relationship with authority itself. They had grown up watching traditional institutions fail, seeing established wisdom prove inadequate, witnessing the collapse of systems that had seemed permanent and unquestionable. This experience did not make them anarchists, but it did make them skeptics, willing to question, to experiment, to imagine alternatives. This skeptical spirit would prove to be one of the plague's most important legacies. It would fuel the Renaissance's celebration of human potential, the Reformation's challenge to religious authority, the scientific revolution's questioning of received wisdom. The children of the plague would become the parents of modernity, carrying within them the hard-won knowledge that change was possible, that improvement was achievable, that the future need not be simply a repetition of the past. As these children grew to adulthood in the 1360s and 1370s, they began to create a culture that reflected their unique formation. They wrote literature that was more psychologically complex than their predecessors, painted pictures that were more emotionally immediate, developed philosophies that were more empirically grounded. They were products of catastrophe, but they were also creators of renewal. The plague had taught its seventh lesson through them, that destruction and creation were part of the same process, that endings were also beginnings, that even the greatest catastrophes could become the foundation for unprecedented possibilities. The children of the plague would build the Renaissance on the ashes of the medieval world, creating beauty from the memory of loss, hope from the experience of despair. In the quiet of their transformed world, they began to dream dreams that their plague-surviving parents could never have imagined. And in those dreams, the seeds of a new civilization were already beginning to take root. In the generation following the Great Dying, the spiritual landscape of Europe underwent a transformation as profound as any political or social change. The plague had shattered more than bodies and communities. It had broken open the very framework through which medieval people understood their relationship with the divine. From the ruins of that broken framework, new forms of faith began to emerge. The crisis had begun during the plague years themselves, when traditional theology seemed powerless to explain or console. How could a loving God permit such suffering? Why did the innocent die alongside the guilty? Where was divine justice when children perished and criminals survived? These questions, whispered in the darkness of plague houses and shouted in the emptiness of decimated cathedrals, could not be answered by the scholastic certainties that had once seemed unshakable. In the mystical tradition that had always run like an underground river through European Christianity, these questions found not answers, but a different kind of response. The mystics had always insisted that God was beyond human understanding, that the divine could only be encountered in the depths of direct experience, not through rational analysis or institutional mediation. Meister Eckhart's teachings, which had been viewed with suspicion by church authorities before the plague, suddenly seemed prophetic. His assertion that God could be found in the darkness as well as the light, that divine presence was most real when all human props had been stripped away, spoke directly to the experience of plague survivors who had found themselves alone with the ultimate mystery. In the Rhineland, where Eckhart's influence was strongest, a new generation of mystics began to emerge. They were marked by a particular kind of spiritual maturity. They had been forced to confront ultimate questions not as theological abstractions, but as lived realities. Their writings, their prayers, their very approach to the spiritual life bore the mark of people who had looked into the abyss and found, to their surprise, that even there they were not alone. Sister Catherine of Strasbourg, who had taken her vows just before the plague arrived, wrote in her spiritual diary, "I used to pray for understanding, for answers, for the clarity that would make sense of God's ways. But the great dying taught me to pray differently. Now I pray for presence, not to understand the darkness, but to know that even in the darkness, I am held. The plague took away my certainty about God's justice, but it gave me something deeper, the knowledge of God's companionship in suffering." This shift from theological understanding to mystical experience was not confined to the monasteries and convents. Ordinary lay people, stripped of the comfort of easy explanations, began to develop more personal, more intimate relationships with the divine. They gathered in small groups in their homes, sharing prayers and meditations that emphasized direct encounter over institutional doctrine. The movement known as the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion, emerged from this spiritual hunger. Founded by Gerard Groot in the Netherlands, it emphasized practical spirituality, personal piety, and the cultivation of interior life. The followers of this movement, known as the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life, lived in community but without formal vows, dedicating themselves to prayer, study, and service while remaining engaged with the ordinary world. What made the modern devotion revolutionary was not its rejection of church authority, but its insistence that authentic spiritual life could be lived by anyone, anywhere, without requiring the mediation of special institutions or extraordinary circumstances. The plague had democratized suffering. The modern devotion democratized access to the divine. Thomas à Kempis, whose Imitation of Christ would become one of the most influential spiritual books in Christian history, was shaped by this post-plague spirituality. His emphasis on inner transformation, rather than external observance, on personal relationship with Christ, rather than institutional conformity, reflected the hard-won wisdom of a generation that had learned to find God in the midst of catastrophe. "Learn to despise external things and give yourself to things internal," he wrote, "and you will perceive the kingdom of God coming within you. The kingdom of God is peace and joy in the Holy Spirit, which is not given to the unholy. Christ will come to you and show you his consolations, if you prepare for him a worthy dwelling within. But the spiritual revolution sparked by the plague was not limited to mysticism and personal devotion. It also produced more radical movements that challenged the institutional church more directly. The experiences of the plague years had exposed the gap between Christian ideals and ecclesiastical reality in ways that could no longer be ignored or explained away. John Wycliffe at Oxford began to articulate a theology that emphasized the authority of Scripture over church tradition, the priesthood of all believers over clerical hierarchy, and the spiritual nature of the true church over its institutional manifestations. His teachings, which would later influence the Protestant Reformation, emerged directly from the post-plague questioning of all traditional authorities. In Bohemia, Jan Hus took up similar themes, preaching that the Church's authority came not from apostolic succession, but from its conformity to Christ's teachings. The corruption and failures revealed during the plague years had made such arguments compelling to audiences who had witnessed the collapse of supposedly divine institutions. The plague had also created space for female voices in ways that would have been impossible in the more rigid hierarchies of the pre-plague world. With so many male clerics dead, with traditional structures weakened, women found new opportunities to exercise spiritual leadership and express theological insights. Julian of Norwich, whose Revelations of Divine Love remains one of the masterpieces of English mystical literature, received her visions during a near-death experience in 1373, just as England was beginning to recover from the plague's devastation. Her theology of divine love, which insisted that ultimately all shall be well and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, spoke directly to the spiritual needs of a generation that had witnessed ultimate darkness. What made Julian's work revolutionary was not just its mystical insights, but its theological sophistication. She was quite possibly the first woman to write theology in English, and her work demonstrates a level of learning and authority that would have been almost impossible for a woman to achieve in the pre-plague world. The spiritual transformation was also visible in the arts and architecture of the period. The serene, otherworldly beauty of earlier medieval religious art gave way to something more human, more immediate, more psychologically complex. Artists who had lived through the plague could not depict the divine as if it was separate from human suffering. It had to be shown as intimately connected to the full range of human experience. The great altarpieces of this period show Christ not just in glory but in agony, not just triumphant but vulnerable. The plague had made it impossible to maintain the theological distance between divine and human that had characterized earlier medieval art. God had to be shown as one who suffered with humanity, not one who remained serenely above human pain. Popular religious practices also began to change. The elaborate liturgical cycles that had marked medieval religious life gave way to simpler, more personal forms of devotion. People began to pray the rosary, to meditate on the Stations of the Cross, to develop intimate personal relationships with particular saints who seemed to understand their struggles. The cult of Saint Roch, who was believed to have died of the plague while caring for other victims, became enormously popular in this period. Unlike the warrior saints or scholar saints of earlier periods, Roch was venerated precisely for his willingness to share in the common human experience of suffering and death. The plague was teaching its eighth lesson, that authentic spirituality had to be grounded in honest acknowledgement of human vulnerability and divine mystery. The confident theological systems of the high medieval period, with their elaborate rational proofs and their comprehensive explanations, had to give way to something more humble, more experiential, more willing to live with questions that had no easy answers. This spiritual revolution would have consequences far beyond the realm of religion. The emphasis on personal experience over institutional authority would fuel the Renaissance celebration of individual human potential. The willingness to question traditional teachings would contribute to the scientific revolution's empirical approach to knowledge. The insistence that truth could be found in direct encounter rather than inherited wisdom would help create the modern world's commitment to experiment and discovery. But perhaps most importantly, the post-plague spiritual transformation created new ways of finding meaning in the face of suffering, new resources for hope in the midst of despair, new possibilities for human flourishing, even in the shadow of mortality. The children of the plague would inherit not just material opportunities, but spiritual tools that would enable them to build something beautiful from the memory of devastation. In the quiet chapels and contemplative communities of post-plague Europe, a new kind of prayer was being born, not the triumphant petitions of conquest and glory, but the humble offerings of survivors who had learned to find grace in the midst of brokenness, love in the heart of loss, hope in the acceptance of mortality. It was a prayer that would echo through the centuries, carried by those who had learned to sing in the darkness. As the 14th century moved toward its close, the children born in the shadow of the Great Dying had grown to adulthood in a world unrecognizable to their grandparents. The demographic catastrophe that had once threatened to end European civilization had instead become the unlikely midwife of a new age. From the ashes of the medieval world, something unprecedented was taking shape, a culture that would celebrate human potential, question ancient authorities, and create beauty that seemed to glow with the intensity of those who had learned how precious and fragile life could be. In Florence, that jewel of the Italian peninsula that had lost half its population to the plague, the survivors found themselves inheritors of unprecedented wealth and opportunity. The great merchant families, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, had consolidated the resources of their fallen competitors. But more importantly, they had absorbed the plague's fundamental lesson, that life was brief, beauty was rare, and human achievement was the most precious legacy that could be left to future generations. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, who founded the banking dynasty that would reshape European finance, was himself a child of the plague years. His approach to wealth was marked by the particular intensity of someone who understood that fortunes, like lives, could vanish in an instant. He invested not just in trade and politics, but in art, in learning, in the kinds of cultural achievements that might outlast the fragility of human existence. The palazzo that Giovanni commissioned was revolutionary not just in its luxury, but in its philosophy. Unlike the fortress-like residences of earlier generations, built to withstand siege and invasion, the Medici Palace was designed to celebrate life, to showcase beauty, to create spaces where human creativity could flourish. Its courtyards were filled with sculpture, its walls covered with frescoes, its libraries stocked with manuscripts that had been rescued from the abandoned monasteries of the plague years. But the transformation was not limited to the wealthy. The plague had created labor shortages that gave ordinary workers unprecedented leverage, and they used that leverage not just to demand better wages, but to claim better lives. Artisans who had once been bound by restrictive guild regulations found themselves free to experiment, to innovate, to develop techniques that would have been forbidden in the more rigid hierarchies of the pre-plague world. In the workshops of Florence, young apprentices learned their crafts from masters who had survived the Great Dying, but these masters taught with a different spirit than their predecessors. They had seen how quickly knowledge could be lost, how easily traditions could be broken, how precious was the human capacity to create something beautiful from raw materials and skillful hands. Donatello, whose bronze David would become the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, was trained in this post-plague environment. His art bore the mark of someone who understood that the human body was both vulnerable and glorious, that physical beauty was a gift to be celebrated precisely because it was temporary. The classical tradition that had been preserved through the medieval centuries suddenly seemed urgently relevant to artists who had learned to value human dignity in the face of human mortality. The intellectual transformation was equally dramatic. The universities that had once been dedicated to preserving and commenting upon ancient authorities began to produce scholars who valued observation over tradition, experimentation over received wisdom. The plague had taught them that human knowledge was fallible, that even the most revered texts could offer no protection against the realities of experience. Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, had lived through the plague years as a young man. His poetry and his scholarship reflected the transformed consciousness of someone who had witnessed the collapse of medieval certainties. He wrote about human emotions with unprecedented psychological sophistication, explored classical texts not as repositories of absolute truth, but as conversations with brilliant minds across the centuries. "I am living in an age which is not my own," Petrarch wrote, expressing the consciousness of someone who stood between two worlds, the medieval world that was dying and the Renaissance world that was being born. "Sometimes I seem to myself to have been born out of due time, either too late or too early. But it was precisely this sense of temporal displacement that made Petrarch and his generation such powerful cultural innovators. They could see both the achievements and the limitations of the past, both the possibilities and the dangers of the future. They were uniquely positioned to synthesize, to create, to imagine new forms of human flourishing. The artistic revolution was perhaps the most visible manifestation of this cultural transformation. In the churches and public buildings of post-plague Europe, a new kind of art began to appear, art that celebrated human dignity, that explored psychological complexity, that found the sacred in the midst of the secular. Giotto, who had begun painting before the plague, lived to see how the catastrophe transformed the reception of his work. His frescoes in the Arena Chapel in Padua, with their unprecedented emotional realism and psychological depth, spoke directly to audiences who had learned to value authentic human experience over stylized religious convention. The plague had taught people to recognize authentic emotion, to value genuine human connection, to distinguish between real spiritual insight and empty ritual. Artists who could capture that authenticity found themselves celebrated and patronized in ways that would have been impossible in the more hierarchical culture of the pre-plague world. Architecture too began to reflect the new consciousness. The Gothic cathedrals of the 13th century, with their soaring verticality and their emphasis on transcendence, gave way to buildings that were more human in scale, more comfortable in their relationship with the earthly world. The palaces and churches of the early Renaissance celebrated beauty for its own sake, created spaces designed for human enjoyment rather than divine intimidation. Brunelleschi's dome for the Cathedral of Florence, completed in the early 15th century, was both a technological marvel and a philosophical statement. It demonstrated that human ingenuity could solve problems that had seemed impossible, that the classical tradition could be not just preserved, but improved upon, that beauty and engineering could work together to create something unprecedented. The literary transformation was equally profound. Writers began to use vernacular languages with a sophistication that had previously been reserved for Latin, creating works that spoke directly to the experiences of ordinary people rather than exclusively to scholarly elites. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in Italian rather than Latin, had already pointed the way. But the post-plague generation took this democratization of high culture much further. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years themselves, captured the new spirit perfectly. Its frame narrative, young people telling stories to distract themselves from the horror of the pestilence, demonstrated how art could serve not just as religious instruction or aristocratic entertainment, but as a fundamental human need for meaning-making in the face of chaos. The stories themselves, with their frank treatment of sexuality, their satirical approach to authority, their celebration of human cleverness and resilience, would have been scandalous in the more regulated culture of the pre-plague world. But audiences who had witnessed the collapse of traditional certainties were ready for literature that acknowledged the full complexity of human nature. Perhaps most importantly, the early Renaissance represented a new relationship with time itself. The medieval consciousness had been oriented toward eternity, viewing earthly life as a brief preparation for an eternal existence in heaven or hell. The plague had not destroyed belief in eternity, but it had intensified awareness of temporal existence, making this life seem more precious because it was so obviously fragile. This new temporal consciousness encouraged people to invest more deeply in earthly achievements, to create art and literature and philosophy that could outlast their creators' brief lives. It sparked the Renaissance obsession with fame, with lasting reputation, with the creation of works that could achieve a kind of earthly immortality. The plague was teaching its ninth lesson, that catastrophe could become the catalyst for unprecedented creativity, that loss could become the foundation for new forms of gain, that even the greatest disasters could become opportunities for human cultures to reinvent themselves. The Black Death had ended the Middle Ages, but in ending them, it had made possible something that might prove even more remarkable. As the 14th century drew to a close, the children and grandchildren of plague survivors looked forward to the 15th century with an optimism that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the Great Dying. They had inherited a world marked by loss, but they had also inherited the freedom to reimagine that world, to create new forms of beauty and meaning that honored both the dead and the living. In the workshops and libraries, the churches and palaces of Renaissance Europe, the sounds of creation could be heard, the sculptor's chisel releasing the hidden form within the marble, the scholar's pen scratching across parchment as new ideas took shape, the architect's compass drawing the plans for buildings that would house dreams not yet dreamed. The Renaissance was dawning, and it carried within its growing light the memory of the darkness from which it had emerged. The plague had taught Europe that endings were also beginnings, that death could give birth to new forms of life, that even the greatest catastrophes could become the foundation for unprecedented human achievement. The Black Death was becoming memory, but it was memory transformed into art, into philosophy, into hope itself. The 15th century opened on a Europe that had been fundamentally reshaped by the Great Dying of the previous century. The population was slowly recovering, but the world into which new generations were born bore little resemblance to the medieval society that had existed before the plague. The pestilence had ended, but its consequences continued to ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching every aspect of human life and culture. In the courts of the emerging nation-states, a new kind of politics was taking shape. The feudal system that had governed Europe for centuries had been weakened by the demographic catastrophe, creating space for more centralized forms of government. Kings who had once been merely first among equals now found themselves able to claim genuine sovereignty over territories where local lords had been decimated by plague or undermined by labor shortages. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which had been raging intermittently since 1337, took on new characteristics in the post-plague world. Armies could no longer be raised in the traditional way through feudal obligation because so many of the feudal obligations had been dissolved. Instead, kings began to hire professional soldiers, creating the foundation for the standing armies that would dominate European warfare for centuries to come. Joan of Arc, that peasant girl who claimed divine visions and inspired French resistance to English occupation, was herself a product of the post-plague world. In the more rigid hierarchies of pre-plague society, a farmer's daughter could never have gained an audience with the Dauphin, much less convinced him to grant her military command. But the social fluidity created by the plague had made such unprecedented advancement possible. Her story captured the imagination of her contemporaries precisely because it embodied the new possibilities that had emerged from the ashes of the old world. She was proof that individual merit could triumph over inherited status, that divine favor could manifest itself through the most unlikely vessels, that the future need not be determined by the patterns of the past. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. The guild system that had regulated medieval commerce was giving way to more flexible forms of trade and manufacturing. Entrepreneurs who might have been constrained by traditional restrictions now found themselves free to experiment with new techniques, new products, new markets. In the textile cities of Flanders, which had been devastated by the plague, innovative weavers began to develop new kinds of cloth that combined traditional techniques with experimental materials. The labor shortage had forced them to become more efficient, more creative, more willing to challenge conventional wisdom about how things should be done. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, represented the culmination of these economic and intellectual changes. The technology itself was not entirely new. Similar techniques had been used in China for centuries, but its development in Europe at this particular moment reflected the unique conditions created by the plague and its aftermath. The demand for books had increased dramatically as literacy spread beyond the traditional clerical and aristocratic elites. The plague had created new economic opportunities for people who might never have learned to read in the old system, and these newly literate populations wanted access to books that had previously been available only to the wealthy or the scholarly. At the same time, the traditional scriptoria of the monasteries had been depleted by the plague, creating a supply crisis that made alternative methods of book production economically attractive. Gutenberg's press was not just a technological innovation, but a response to specific social and economic conditions that had been created by the demographic catastrophe of the previous century. The first book printed on Gutenberg's press was, appropriately, the Bible, but it was a Bible that would reach audiences undreamed of by medieval scribes. Within decades, printing presses were established across Europe, spreading not just religious texts but secular literature, scientific treatises, political pamphlets, and popular entertainment. This democratization of knowledge would have consequences that stretched far beyond the 15th century. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century would be unthinkable without the printing press. The scientific revolution would depend on the rapid circulation of experimental results and theoretical innovations. The political revolutions of the early modern period would be sparked by pamphlets and broadsides that could reach mass audiences for the first time in human history. But the printing press was just one manifestation of a broader intellectual transformation that had been sparked by the plague. The Renaissance was reaching its full flowering, producing art and literature that celebrated human potential in ways that would have seemed blasphemous to medieval sensibilities. In Florence, Cosimo de' Medici established the Platonic Academy, a gathering place for scholars who sought to synthesize Christian theology with classical philosophy. The Academy represented something entirely new in European intellectual life, a space where ideas could be explored for their own sake, where learning was pursued not just for its practical applications, but for the sheer joy of understanding. The scholars of the Academy, like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, developed a new kind of humanism, that celebrated the dignity and potential of human beings. Their work built on the foundation laid by earlier humanists like Petrarch, but they took the celebration of human achievement to new heights. Pico's Oration on the Dignity of Man, written in the 1480s, articulated a vision of humanity that would have been shocking to medieval theologians. He argued that human beings were unique among God's creatures because they had been given the freedom to shape their own nature, to become whatever they chose to become through the exercise of their will and intellect. This philosophical anthropology reflected the real social changes that had been occurring since the plague. In a world where traditional hierarchies had been disrupted, where individual merit could triumph over inherited status, where new opportunities were constantly emerging, it made sense to celebrate human freedom and potential in ways that had not been possible in the more rigid structures of the pre-plague world. The artistic achievements of the period were equally revolutionary. In the workshops of Florence and Rome, artists were developing techniques that would transform the visual representation of the human world. Perspective, which had been rediscovered and refined by artists like Brunelleschi and Alberti, allowed painters to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces. This was not merely a technical advance, but a philosophical statement about humanity's relationship with the natural world. Medieval art had often deliberately avoided realistic representation, preferring symbolic or stylized depictions that emphasized spiritual over physical reality. But post-plague artists were interested in capturing the world as it actually appeared to human eyes, celebrating the beauty and complexity of material existence rather than treating it as a mere shadow of eternal truth. Leonardo da Vinci, born in 1452, embodied this new approach to understanding the world. His notebooks, filled with anatomical drawings, engineering designs, and scientific observations, reflected a conviction that the natural world could be understood through careful observation and experimentation. His famous declaration that learning never exhausts the mind captured the intellectual optimism of a generation that had inherited freedom from many traditional constraints. The Mona Lisa, painted in the early years of the 16th century, represented the culmination of this artistic revolution. The painting's psychological complexity, its subtle realism, its celebration of an individual human being would have been inconceivable in the symbolic art of the medieval period. It was art that assumed the worthiness of human attention, the value of individual personality, the beauty of the material world. But the long echo of the plague was not limited to the high culture of Renaissance Italy. Across Europe, new forms of popular culture were emerging that reflected the transformed social conditions of the post-plague world. Folk festivals that had once been restricted by religious and social conventions became more elaborate and more inclusive. Popular literature began to explore themes of social mobility and individual achievement that would have been irrelevant to earlier audiences. The rise of the picaresque novel, with its celebration of clever individuals who succeeded through wit rather than birth, reflected the new social realities of a world where traditional hierarchies had been weakened. Stories of peasants who became merchants, merchants who became nobles, nobles who lost their fortunes and had to earn their way back to respectability, spoke to audiences who lived in a world where such transformations had become commonplace. The religious landscape continued to evolve as well. The mystical movements that had emerged during and immediately after the plague continued to flourish, offering forms of spirituality that emphasized personal experience over institutional authority. The Devotio Moderna spread across northern Europe, creating communities of laypeople who sought to live devout lives without rejecting engagement with the secular world. At the same time, criticisms of church corruption became more widespread and more systematic. The papacy itself had been weakened by the disasters of the 14th century, the Avignon papacy, the Great Schism, the challenge of conciliar movements that argued for democratic governance of the Church. These institutional crises had been exacerbated by the moral challenges posed by the plague, when many clergy had fled their responsibilities, while others had died heroically in service to their flocks. Jan Hus in Bohemia and John Wycliffe in England had already begun to articulate theologies that challenged papal authority and emphasized the primacy of Scripture. Their ideas found increasingly receptive audiences among populations that had learned to question traditional authorities during the chaos of the plague years. The invention of printing made these alternative religious ideas much more dangerous to church authorities. Ideas that had once been confined to university debates or small circles of scholars could now reach mass audiences. The stage was being set for the religious upheavals of the 16th century, when Martin Luther's protests would ignite a reformation that split European Christianity permanently. The exploration of the wider world was another consequence of the social and intellectual changes sparked by the plague. The demographic catastrophe had created labor shortages that made new sources of wealth attractive. The intellectual revolution had encouraged curiosity about the natural world and confidence in human ability to understand and master it. The economic changes had created new forms of investment and risk-taking that made ambitious voyages financially feasible. Portuguese expeditions along the African coast, supported by Prince Henry the Navigator, were seeking new routes to the spice markets of Asia. Spanish explorers were beginning to contemplate westward voyages across the Atlantic. These expeditions were motivated by the same spirit of innovation and experimentation that was transforming European art, literature, and science. Christopher Columbus, whose voyages would begin in 1492, was himself a product of the post-plague world. His conviction that he could reach Asia by sailing west reflected the intellectual confidence of a generation that had learned to question received wisdom. His ability to secure financial backing from the Spanish crown reflected the new forms of economic organization that had emerged from the disruption of traditional systems. The consequences of European exploration and colonization would be catastrophic for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But from the European perspective, these voyages represented the culmination of the intellectual and social transformation that had been sparked by the Black Death. They were evidence that human beings could transcend the limitations of their inherited circumstances, that knowledge and courage could open new worlds, that the future could be fundamentally different from the past. The plague was teaching its 10th lesson, that transformation once begun could continue for generations, creating changes that rippled far beyond the original catastrophe. The Europe of 1450 was not just different from the Europe of 1347. It was different in ways that would have been unimaginable to people living before the plague. New forms of government, new economic systems, new artistic traditions, new religious movements, new ways of understanding the human place in the natural world, all of these had emerged from the chaos and loss of the 14th century. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. Europeans of the mid-15th century lived with a different relationship to possibility itself. They had inherited the knowledge that dramatic change was possible, that catastrophe could become opportunity, that individuals could transcend the circumstances of their birth, that the future could be shaped by human will and intelligence. This psychological transformation would prove to be the Black Death's most enduring legacy. Long after the demographic losses had been recovered, long after the specific economic and social disruptions had been resolved, Europeans would retain the conviction that change was normal, that improvement was possible, that human beings were not condemned to repeat the patterns of the past. This conviction would fuel the age of exploration, the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and all the other transformative movements that would shape the modern world. The Black Death had ended the Middle Ages, not just chronologically but psychologically, creating a mentality that was oriented toward the future rather than the past, toward innovation rather than tradition, toward human possibility rather than divine inevitability. In the workshops and libraries, the laboratories and printing houses of mid-15th century Europe, the sounds of this transformation could be heard: the quiet scratch of pens recording new observations, the steady rhythm of printing presses multiplying ideas, the patient tap of hammers shaping metal into new forms, the whispered conversations of scholars discovering new ways to understand the world. The echo of the Great Dying continued to reverberate, but it was no longer an echo of despair. It had become an echo of possibility, carrying forward through the centuries the hard-won knowledge that even the greatest catastrophes could become the foundation for unprecedented human achievement. The Black Death was teaching its final lesson, that endings were always also beginnings, that destruction and creation were part of the same eternal process, that human resilience was stronger than any force that could be brought against it. As the 15th century reached its midpoint, Europe had completed a transformation so profound that it seemed like a different civilization entirely. The world that had emerged from the ashes of the Black Death bore the marks of its traumatic birth, but those marks had become sources of strength rather than weakness, scars that had healed into a more flexible and resilient form of human culture. In the city of Florence, now the undisputed center of Renaissance civilization, the grandchildren of plague survivors walked through streets lined with palaces that celebrated human achievement. The Medici Bank had become the most powerful financial institution in Europe, but its power was exercised through patronage of art and learning rather than mere accumulation of wealth. Cosimo de' Medici, known as the father of his country, had learned the plague's fundamental lesson, that the only wealth that truly mattered was the wealth that could outlast the brevity of human life. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, crowned by Brunelleschi's magnificent dome, stood as a symbol of this transformed consciousness. The dome itself was a technological marvel, demonstrating that human ingenuity could solve problems that had seemed impossible. But it was also a philosophical statement about the relationship between earth and heaven, asserting that the sacred could be found within the human rather than only beyond it. In the shadow of that dome, artists and scholars pursued their work with an intensity that reflected their inherited understanding of time's preciousness. Marsilio Ficino translated the complete works of Plato into Latin, making the philosophical foundations of Western thought available to European readers for the first time in 1,000 years. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola composed his Oration on the Dignity of Man, that magnificent statement of humanistic optimism that declared human beings to be the only creatures capable of becoming whatever they chose to become. But the transformation was not limited to the elite circles of Renaissance humanism. Across Europe, ordinary people lived with a different relationship to possibility than their ancestors had known. The guild restrictions that had once limited economic mobility had been weakened by the labor shortages following the plague. The social hierarchies that had once seemed divinely ordained had been revealed as human constructions that could be changed by human action. A blacksmith's son in German Mainz could become a printer and revolutionize the spread of knowledge. A farmer's daughter in French Domremy could claim divine visions and change the course of a war. A weaver's apprentice in Flemish Bruges could develop new techniques that transformed an entire industry. The plague had taught Europe that change was normal, that improvement was possible, that the future need not replicate the past. This psychological transformation manifested itself in countless ways. The literature of the period was marked by a new interest in individual psychology, in the exploration of human motivation and emotion. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the decades following the plague, created characters who were recognizably human in their complexity, their contradictions, their capacity for both nobility and baseness. The visual arts developed techniques that captured this psychological complexity with unprecedented subtlety. Portrait painting, which had been rare in medieval art, became increasingly common as artists and patrons alike became interested in celebrating individual personality. The faces that looked out from Renaissance paintings were not generic representations of human types, but specific individuals with particular histories, particular emotions, particular relationships to the world around them. Architecture evolved to reflect the new balance between public and private, between sacred and secular, between individual achievement and community solidarity. The palaces of the Renaissance were designed not as fortresses against a hostile world, but as spaces for the cultivation and display of human excellence. Their courtyards and gardens, their libraries and galleries, their chambers for music and conversation, all testified to a confidence in the value of human culture and the possibility of human flourishing. The printing press, that revolutionary invention that had emerged from the post-plague economy, was spreading books and ideas across Europe at a rate that would have been inconceivable to earlier generations. By 1450, there were printing presses in most major European cities, and the number of books in circulation was increasing exponentially. Knowledge that had once been the privilege of a tiny, scholarly elite was becoming accessible to anyone who could read. This democratization of knowledge had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate circle of readers. Ideas that challenged traditional authorities could now spread rapidly across national and linguistic boundaries. Scientific observations and mathematical innovations could be shared between scholars who had never met. Religious reformers could communicate directly with mass audiences without depending on institutional approval. The stage was being set for all the great transformations of the early modern period. The Protestant Reformation would be unthinkable without the printing press. The scientific revolution would depend on the rapid circulation of experimental results and theoretical innovations. The age of exploration would be motivated by the same spirit of curiosity and confidence that was transforming European intellectual life. But perhaps the most profound change was in humanity's relationship with suffering itself. The plague had taught Europeans that catastrophe was not necessarily meaningless, that destruction could become the foundation for creation, that even the worst disasters could become opportunities for unprecedented human achievement. This was not a simple optimism that denied the reality of pain and loss. The art and literature of the Renaissance were marked by a deep awareness of human mortality, a consciousness that beauty was precious precisely because it was fragile. The memento mori, reminders of death, that appeared in Renaissance art were not morbid obsessions but affirmations of life's value. The plague had taught its final and most important lesson, that human beings were capable of creating meaning from meaninglessness, hope from despair, beauty from the raw materials of existence itself. This lesson would echo through the centuries, inspiring generation after generation to believe that no catastrophe was final, that no defeat was absolute, that the human spirit was stronger than any force that could be brought against it. In the quiet of a monastery library, where a scholar bent over a manuscript by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of the past while adding his own insights for the future. In the noise of a printing house, where workers set type for books that would carry new ideas to distant shores. In the controlled chaos of an artist's workshop, where apprentices learned to see the world with fresh eyes and to create images that had never existed before. In all these places, The echo of the Black Death could still be heard, but it was no longer an echo of despair. It had become an echo of possibility, a reminder that even the greatest darkness could give birth to unprecedented light. The plague had ended the Middle Ages, but in ending them it had made possible something that might prove even more remarkable, a form of human civilization that was oriented toward growth rather than mere survival, toward innovation rather than mere preservation, toward the exploration of human potential rather than the acceptance of human limitation. The survivors had learned to sing in the darkness, and their song had become a lullaby for the future. In that song, all the pain and loss of the plague years had been transformed into something beautiful, something hopeful, something that honored both the dead and the living by insisting that human existence was meaningful, that human achievement was valuable, that the brief span of individual life could contribute to something larger and more enduring than itself. The Black Death was becoming memory, but it was memory transformed into wisdom, loss transformed into gain, ending transformed into beginning. In the libraries and workshops, the churches and palaces of Renaissance Europe, the great work of human civilization continued, carried forward by those who had learned that even the deepest winter could give way to spring, that even the longest night would eventually yield to dawn. And in that dawn, shaped by darkness but no longer defined by it, humanity would continue its ancient work of creating meaning, beauty, and hope in the face of an uncertain world. The plague had taught its last lesson, but the learning would continue forever, passed down through the generations like a sacred trust, a reminder that human resilience was stronger than any catastrophe, that love was more powerful than loss, that the human spirit could not be conquered by any force in heaven or earth. Listen, can you hear it? In the silence that follows the storm, in the peace that comes after the long struggle, the voices of the survivors still sing. They sing of memory and hope, of loss and discovery, of endings that become beginnings. They sing the eternal song of human endurance, human creativity, human love. And in their singing, the Black Death finds its final transformation, from destroyer to teacher, from ending to beginning, from death to the promise of new life. Sleep now, and dream of spring. The Black Death swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population. But from the ashes of that catastrophe emerged the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the age of exploration, and the foundations of the modern world. The plague teaches us still that even the greatest disasters can become opportunities for unprecedented human achievement, that endings are also beginnings, and that the human spirit is capable of creating beauty and meaning, even in the face of ultimate darkness. May we carry that lesson with us as we face our own challenges, our own uncertainties, our own moments when the future seems as dark as a medieval night. For we are the inheritors of those who learn to sing in the darkness, and their song lives on in us. Rest well and dream of the light that always follows the longest night.